Welcome back, everyone. Our next guest is Dr. Colin Carter. He's with the Institute of Human Nutrition and Departments of Pediatrics and Emergency Medicine at Columbia University. Colin, welcome to the Real Science Exchange. Glad to have you here today.
Thanks very much.
Listened to your presentation earlier today, found it very fascinating. Before we get started into that, would you mind giving the audience just kind of an overview of yourself and some of the work that you're doing?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a pediatrician at Columbia, as you mentioned. My clinical world's in pediatric emergency medicine, but I've been doing work in longitudinal birth cohorts, looking at how events that happen during pregnancy affect long-term child development for about 20 years. And my focus has mainly been looking at fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and my particular interest has been in how both maternal and child nutrition might impact the teratogenic effects of alcohol.
Okay. And that was pretty much an overview of the presentation today as well. Why don't you give us kind of maybe a little more detailed explanation of some of the findings that you presented during the presentation today?
Sure. So, prenatal alcohol exposure is the most common preventable cause of developmental delay worldwide. And I think a lot of people working both clinically and in the research world for a long time have been a bit almost frustrated with the disease because we're learning more and more about kind of how alcohol affects development. But, it's hard to know how to fix this problem. And I think for a lot of people, they say, oh, just get the pregnant women to stop drinking. And I've definitely had paper reviews and grant reviews that have said that. It's just so short-sighted. Alcohol use is a really complicated problem for a lot of people. Also, by the time we meet pregnant women, often they're halfway through their pregnancy already. And then asking someone who has an alcohol use disorder to just, stop drinking like that when they're only however many weeks left of pregnancy is probably not realistic for a lot of women. And so looking at animal models, supplementing a pregnant dam, usually in a rodent model, with choline seems to ameliorate at least some of the teratogenic effects of alcohol. And so in our birth cohorts in South Africa, we've been really interested in testing this hypothesis. And so we did a pilot feasibility study in just 70 women, really looking at feasibility, trying to see could we even really do an effective or a real robust clinical trial in heavy drinking pregnant women. And the answer was yes, but notably in only 70 women, we saw some pretty impressive treatment effects. And so I went over those today. We saw beneficial effects of choline treatment on growth, but also on neurobehavior and memory in these kids. And so that's been pretty exciting. It's no one's going to change clinical practice on a global scale, at least on a study of 70 mother-child pairs. And so now we're doing a larger clinical trial, hopefully with a subject number of around 300 that we started just this past April. And so hopefully in the next few years, we'll have some more definitive results.
And where will that take place at, that trial?
Also in Cape Town, in South
Okay.
Africa. Yeah.
And you picked Cape Town because?
So, interestingly, for me, one of the reasons why I want to keep working there is because that's where I think people have almost the greatest chance of benefit because fetal alcohol spectrum disorders is so prevalent there. And we know that FASD are really common in the United States as well, maybe 2 to 5% of school-age children, but it's really hard to recruit for studies like that. So, we've done projections, and to really recruit for a randomized clinical trial of 300 kids, you'd probably have to screen, several thousand women in the United States. And so with NIH budgets, that's not really that feasible. And so the study's a little bit, more feasible to do in South Africa as well. But again, like my hope, choline's not patentable. It's very inexpensive. My hope is that with the results of this study, we could potentially see some, policy changes where this might become supplementation for heavy drinking pregnant women. There might become the norm.
Mm-hmm. Good follow-up question on that, because I know one of the things that's, a little bit, obviously it's a big problem, but I think it's not just, it tends to affect people at different socioeconomic levels.
Right.
So you talk about the population you're looking at. Little known fact, but actually the reason we have the American Medical Association recommendation is because of a psychiatrist in Chicago named Dr. Carl Bell. And he did a lot of work sort of getting into inner city effects of FASD and how it keeps, kind of the inner city population in a difficult position. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering in terms of that, do you think there are social aspects and pressure on the policy? I've seen similar types of things out of the University of Colorado with, underserved populations
Right.
and having that huge impact you're talking about.
Right. I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword. If you look at diseases like cystic fibrosis or, other like relatively rare pediatric diseases that tend to affect a broader spectrum of the population or a more affluent perspective, slice of the population. You have like parent advocacy groups, you have school advocacy groups, you have marathons and things like this, raising funds and awareness. And I think because of the stigma around
Right.
drinking during pregnancy, but I think also because it tends to occur more commonly in impoverished populations, you have less of this advocacy and this awareness. So if anything, I feel like one of my jobs when I give these talks is to impress upon people what a big public health problem this is and how under-recognized it is. I think, but then that also means that this is a population that really could benefit, greatly, which is exciting. So.
Yeah, no, that's good.
As far as kind of, in a way, like kind of cycles of kind of perpetuating poverty, you look at South Africa and in the ethnic group that we work with, FASD are, it's up at least prevalent in 10% of the kids in the community we're in. And if you think about from a diminished potential perspective, it's like that's just going to perpetuate the poverty that's already there, and the poverty perpetuates the drinking. So it'd be nice to try to start to break this cycle somehow, even if we could just start chipping at it, So.
How much of it is alcoholism versus kids being kids?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question globally. Within South Africa, the women in our studies are drinking, they're binge drinking, somewhere around 8 to 10 drinks per occasion, but mainly on a few weekends a month. They're not your chronic alcoholics that you picture when you hear alcohol use disorder. Where I do, for this recent study that we just started in April, in a way that we hadn't seen before, we were finding women when we were screening who were drinking a lot, particularly women who worked on vineyards and on fruit farms where alcohol is really available, drinking like a lot, even more than we had seen before, like 12, 15 drinks per occasion, 3 weekends a month. But they find out they're pregnant and they were stopping drinking, which is very exciting because I hadn't seen that kind of change in the behavior in the South African cohorts. And I've been working there since 2000. But I think what that speaks to me is the women we noticed who were stopping drinking tended to be employed, and they tended, and this is very qualitative, but I don't have a p-value for this, but they tended to ask us if they could go over the consent form with their boyfriends or their mothers, which to me really signified more family involvement. And it's like, okay, here's a group of women who are partaking in risky behavior, like most people in their young 20s do. There's a reason why car insurance is more expensive before you turn 25.
Sure.
And but then they're able to stop. Whereas the women in our studies in the past and the women who we're recruiting now, who tend to keep drinking, are women who tend to be unemployed or underemployed and tend to have kind of the stresses of poverty adding to them. And if you're really stressed, it's a lot harder to say no to something that pretty much guarantees you a good Friday night. That's.
Can you talk a little bit about prevalence as it relates to dose, persistency, and even stage of gestation?
Sure. Maybe I'll speak to the stage of gestation first because it's
Yep.
easy. Alcohol is definitely dangerous through the whole pregnancy.
Got it.
From the animal models, we're learning that, there are different effects. Like certainly if you want to look at the effects of alcohol on specific organs like cardiac development, most of the heart's formed by the end of the first trimester. So that's where you're most vulnerable there. But when we think about kind of the diminished potential and the things that matter to adults living with FASD, we think about the social learning and cognitive delays. Those are going to occur in different ways by alcohol causing brain damage throughout gestation.
Okay.
So I will say that like when I meet people who've been to like a couple weddings before they knew they were pregnant, who just got drunk a couple of times during the first trimester, I try to be really reassuring there. So we're talking about chronic exposure to binge drinking. That's really the most concerning and the most risky. There's a really neat group of papers that are coming out right now from a large group. So in the 1980s and 90s, there were a few major FASD prospective birth cohorts in the United States. One was in Detroit with Sandy and Joe Jacobson. Two were in Atlanta with Claire Coles. There's one in Pittsburgh with Nancy Day, and then another in Seattle with Ann Streisguth, who's unfortunately passed away, but she's one of her proteges who's now really an established investigator. Heather Carmichael Olson's been taking over from that. And they got together and the advances in one meta-analysis over the last 15 years have been really huge, and they worked with some really amazing biostatisticians to pool their cohorts and try to get at these questions of effect sizes and kind of what are the dose patterns that most affect the brain. And what's really neat is they can look at kind of this in tandem, two measures of exposure. One is like dose per occasion, so how much is a person drinking when they drink, and then the other is drinking frequency. And so instead of getting like this number, like you shouldn't drink more than 2 drinks per day on average, they get these almost weather maps where you can say like, okay, what's the risk? How many, like not IQ points, but how many, standardized points or standard deviations from the mean are you likely to drop if your mother drank this frequency at this dose? You can almost calculate it there. And so what you see is what you'd expect is at really infrequent drinking, you can get, you can drink pretty good amount per occasion a couple of times during pregnancy without worrying. And then at more common drinking, you don't have to drink as much as you'd guess. So, but I do think like there were kind of 2 fundamental lessons. One is that binge drinking is really the problem, regardless of frequency. And the other is we were kind of expecting a hockey stick pattern of dose response, where at the lower levels you probably wouldn't see much, and then as you cross some sort of threshold, it starts to climb. And we didn't see that. There's really like a linear effect throughout. Of course, the effects at really, really low doses, per occasion and low frequency are small. Like you're not going to have a kid who's going to necessarily have trouble struggling in school at those really, really low doses. But we didn't see that kind of, we call it a hockey stick, but that kind of flattened line of no effect that then starts to creep up past a certain threshold. And that was a surprise, but I think it also jives with what the clinicians have been saying all along, which is that, effectively no amount of drinking during pregnancy is safe. At the same time, if someone drinks a couple of times before they learn they're pregnant, they shouldn't worry too much that their kid's going to have a lot of trouble. It's we're all human, and like you think about all the things people do with like not getting their hair dyed and avoiding deli meat and all of these things. And I think at these lower levels of exposure, we're really kind of splitting hairs there. If that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. Tom, anything else?
No, I just think I think we've seen a lot of information from several speakers about the deficit of choline potentially being a problem. So it just seems like now you've got potentially another effect where you've got a population that may not be getting adequate choline to begin with.
Right.
They need more during pregnancy,
Yeah.
and suddenly they have these insults. So I can see how this is a major game changer for these types of pregnancies.
Yeah, I really hope
commend you
so.
on the work.
Yeah, I hope so, and it's exciting because it's something that's feasible. We don't need a $75,000 medication regimen here.
Yeah.
It's,
I don't want to get the cart before the horse, but I found myself thinking, okay, is one, how are you going to get it into them, right? Is it going to be a supplement? If they're not willing to stop drinking, are they going to be willing to take a supplement? And then if they do, is it going to be almost a license to be able to drink because I've got this? Lots of questions, right?
Yeah.
It's
they're all questions that keep me up at night, and I have to almost like say I'm not allowed to think about that after 8 p.m. Like my worst nightmare is that Absolute Vodka teams up with Balchem and creates like a choline vodka.
Not going to happen.
Yeah, I know. Jonathan.
We have a regulatory group. Don't worry.
Jonathan and I have joked about that, and not so much joked, but we've shared that fear, and I don't think there's any nutrient or intervention that's going to block all of the effects of alcohol, and I think that messaging can be pretty clear from before the horse or the cart are on the road. I think like as I said earlier, stopping your alcohol patterns is complicated, and I think you're right that if the first focus should always be on alcohol reduction, and then if we do some sort of choline supplementation for heavy drinking pregnant women, it really has to be tied to like also trying to reduce alcohol. Otherwise, you're missing an opportunity too. Again, like what I was mentioning with the impact of poverty, like we should be doing that kind of thing as part of a holistic support intervention, not just like handing them a box of choline and saying good luck with your pregnancy, for sure. Unfortunately, as a public health world, we're pretty bad at a lot of those things. So I want to be optimistic and yet somewhat cynical. And then lastly, I think the question of how to give it to them. We've been doing the choline trials with a beverage powder that looks a little bit like those Crystal Light drink packs that people use, like the single serving ones. And the women have been really willing to do it. And I think we're lucky that in South Africa there's like a few soft drinks that taste pretty similar to it that people really like. So we were surprised at how feasible it was and how well the uptake was. I don't know how that'll be on a global scale, but I think thinking creatively in general about how to get big doses of choline to people is really smart. There's a guy here from Baylor Children's who said he had worked on a formulation where they could bake a good gram of choline chloride into a lemon flavored cookie that people really liked. And I said, oh, that's great, like I'm all for it. And actually, if you really want to improve adherence, maybe you have a few options. Like today, you can have the beverage or the cookie. It's,
Well, and I think the good news is that we're seeing on our side, at least from consumer insights, that people are much more open to food and beverage fortification.
sure.
So, that traditional got to have it in a single tablet is
Yeah.
going away now. So
Yeah,
I
that's
think
awesome.
that's a good thing for everyone.
Yeah, for not for a lot of nutrients, right? Like we could use some better adaptable formulations for things like iron too. And
Absolutely.
Yeah. Final question: if you were put together a elevator speech for your talk today, what would that be?
I would say that, again, I'd always start with the fact that prenatal alcohol exposure is really such an under-recognized cause of brain damage and developmental delay worldwide, that, we should always focus on harm reduction and decreasing prenatal alcohol exposure where we can, and as I mentioned, in a real holistic, supportive approach to women who are drinking when they're pregnant. But there's some real exciting hope here for choline to possibly, mitigate at least some of the teratogenic effects of alcohol in the case where the woman's unable to reduce her drinking or where she's already been drinking for a good amount of the pregnancy already.
Very well said. Fascinating research, important research, and I thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's
Thank
been a
you.
Very
pleasure.
welcome. Thanks.
Thanks.